Analysis from a decade of benchmarking data from the World Economic Forum's Energy Transition Index 2021 indicates that only 10% of the 115 countries analyzed maintained a steady upward trajectory towards energy transition. India ranks 87th on the index. In the upcoming panel discussion, our industry experts will discuss financing India's decade of energy transition. I would like to invite Mr. Subrahmanyam Pulipaka, CEO, National Solar Energy Federation of India, to moderate this panel discussion. Over to you, Mr. Pulipaka.
Today, the global energy transition has crossed many milestones. And just in the last decade, our solar energy capacity increased sevenfold and the wind energy capacity increased threefold. As we move into the decade of action, finance becomes a very important aspect when we talk about energy transition. India, as we speak, has an ambitious target of 450 gigawatt by 2030. And if we are to achieve it, we will be home to one of the largest and the most ambitious energy transition story of the world. As we speak today, India is home to the world's fifth largest fleet of solar capacity and fourth largest fleet of wind capacity. We want to quadruple our renewable energy capacity in the next 10 years. To discuss India's RE ambitions and financing this decade of India's energy transition, we have a stellar panel in front of us. I am Subrahmanyam Pulipaka, the CEO of National Solar Energy Federation of India, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's session. It will be an understatement to call this panel stellar. This eminent panel consists of bankers, funds, representatives from private equity, policymakers, and of course, the industry. So without much delay, let's jump right into the discussion. It is my privilege and honor to introduce today's panelists. And to begin with, we have with us Shri Deepak Bagla, the Managing Director and CEO of Invest India. Invest India, as we know, is India's primary investment agency, from investment promotion agency. It's a non-profit venture under the Department of Promotion and Industry and Internal Trade, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Government of India. Shri Bagla has a professional career of over 3 decades with the World Bank, Citibank, and private equity, having responsibilities across Europe, Africa, and Asia. He is presently a member of several high-level government committees, including FinTech, Innovation, and Infrastructure, and he is also on the advisory board of the government's $7 billion fund of funds for MSMEs and the investment committee for the government US $1.5 billion fund of funds for startups. Welcome, Mr. Bagla, for today's panel discussion. We also have with us Mr. Simon Stolp, South Asia Head for Energy, World Bank. Mr. Stolp currently leads the World Bank's $5 billion energy sector engagement in India, which is growing rapidly and providing significant financing and technical support for India's renewable energy development. His investments are aimed at turning India's financially stressed distribution sector. The World Bank will commit over $1 billion in financing to support India's solar PV development. And they have also signed a joint declaration in support of India-led International Solar Alliance. Prior to this, Mr. Stolp has been engaged in the Middle East and North African region, managing energy policy and strategy dialogue, and a portfolio of loan and technical assistance projects to the energy sector. Welcome, Mr. Stolp. We're very glad to have you on today's panel. We are equally delighted to have Ms. Anita George, Executive Vice President and Deputy Head of CDPQ Global. CDPQ, as we all know, is a leading private equity, infrastructure, and real estate investor which actively invests in all developed markets and in targeted growth markets. Ms. George, in her present role as the Executive Vice President and Deputy Head of CDPQ, fills a key role in developing CDPQ's activities in its three priority international areas: the United States or Latin America, Europe, and of course, the Asia Pacific. She actively participates in positioning CDPQ internationally as well as developing and executing its globalization strategy. Prior to joining CDPQ, Ms. George was Senior Director of World Bank's Energy and Extractive Industries Global Practice. She also held the positions of Director, Infrastructure and Natural Resource of the International Finance Corporation, a member of World Bank Group, and Head of Siemens Financial Services in India. Welcome, Ms. George. We are pleased to have you in today's panel. We are equally delighted to have Mr. Pratik Agarwal, Managing Director of Sterlite Power, with us today. Sterlite Power, as we are all familiar, is India's leading integrated power transmission developer and solution provider globally, focused on addressing complex challenges in the sector by tackling the key constraints of time, space, and capital. Mr. Agarwal is the Managing Director of Sterlite Power, and he has held this position since June 2016. Previously, he was the Vice Chairman of Sterlite Grid and also the Director of the Infrastructure Business for the Vedanta Group. He is a Wharton graduate and an MBA from London Business School with over 10 years of experience in building core infrastructure assets in India. He founded this group's infrastructure business in 2009 and built it up to levels where it is now. It has now significant investments in ports, power transmission, as well as broadband network. Welcome, Mr. Agarwal, to this panel. Finally, it is my pleasure to also invite Mr. Manav Bansal, the Chief Investment Officer of Neev Fund. Neev Fund was conceptualized and launched in 2015 by our Honorable Prime Minister Sri Narendra Modi and UK Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister Mr. David Cameron, to catalyze investment in Indian states which have traditionally not received private investments. The output envisaged from this initiative was creating a model for sustainable development that can provide economic, social, as well as environmental benefits apart from creating jobs. Mr. Bansal himself has been a private equity investor and investment banker for more than 20 years in infrastructure, healthcare, and technology domains. Earlier, he was the founding member of Macquarie's infrastructure team in India, which raised 1.2 US billion dollars in partnership with IFC Washington and State Bank of India. He also headed India's operations for Breitling Partners, an investment and advisory firm headed out of Tokyo in Japan, which was focusing on Indo-Japan investment and in Asia. He was also the partner at Brescon, a shop specializing in special situation asset advisory. He also comes with a rich experience of corporate finance by working at PwC, KPMG, and other leading corporate advisory firms. Welcome to the panel, Mr. Bansal. So without much delay, let's get right into the discussion. And I would like to start with Mr. Simon. Mr. Simon, having seen the perspective of energy transition in many countries, and of course now as a part of World Bank, which is being a valuable partner in India's energy transition, what do you think makes India's story unique?
Thanks, Subu, and thank you for having me here today. You outlined in your opening some of the impressive achievements that India has made over the past decade. When I look around the region, I think you can attribute that to some of the forward-leaning policy that the government has adopted. And in the regional role that I now have, and looking at the other countries across South Asia and into East Asia Pacific, India really does distinguish itself in terms of the policy stance it has taken. But I don't think that's what really makes India's ambitions and achievements in energy transitions unique in the global spectrum of energy transitions. What really sets India apart is the fact that this has been a true step change for India. It has come on the top of a system that is growing rapidly, that is not yet fully matured, and it has created significant disruption within that system, and managing that disruption is an ongoing issue, I think. If you look at India's forward planning for power generation 10 years ago, It included around 600 gigawatts of coal thermal power generation that are no longer part of India's forward plans. In the last several years only, last 2 or 3 years, I think CEA has again revised its coal thermal power projections downwards by about 50 gigawatts. This gives a sense of the significance of the disruption that India's policy stance has created within its energy mix. Secondly, what India has accomplished has been on a base where some of the fundamentals are still being addressed. India has still been pursuing universal access. It is still plagued by deep financial stress within its retail sector, within its distribution sector, and a significant risk profile as a result of that. And yet, based on those policies and with significant private sector interest in the sector, it has achieved a lot even within that context. I think that speaks to achievement, but also speaks to some of the binding constraints that are going to impact India's ability to continue to scale up renewables, continue to scale up some of the complementary technologies that will support renewables integration, and continue to invest in and mobilize finance for renewable sector investment. And I think we'll come back to that later in the discussion. Let me stop here and turn back to you, Subra.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simon. And just building on your answer, I would now like to request Mr. Bagla. Mr. Bagla, India was literally having few megawatts of renewable capacity not so long ago. And today we are almost, like I mentioned, the 4th largest country for the wind capacity, 5th largest for solar. So how do you look at the success of India's renewable energy story so far? And what are the factors that influence this success?
Thank you, Subbu. Let me just take on from where Simon left, and I completely agree with him. Policy has a role, and a very significant role to play in this entire transition period. Look at the entire jump, 2014 to 2014, 15 to 20. Let's just talk about the past 5 years. When Prime Minister Modi came into power, he put up a goal of 175 gigawatts in the next 5 years, and everybody said it's impossible. Simon, I'm sure you'll agree with that. And we're already close to it. In fact, by 2022, we might be able to achieve that even before 2022. And now it's been revised to 450, as you just said, in the next 10 years. So there are two things which will happen. One is the leadership and the policy. That is very, very critical. It gives a focus. It gives the environment, the ecosystem development. And it also is a very strong message out to the world that what we are looking at. And for example, India opened the renewable energy sector completely 100% to FDI. Now look at some statistics on that one. From 2000 to 2020, I've had about 20 billion odd of $10 billion odd of FDI in the sector. Over 50% of that has come only in the past 5 years. I'm just showing you the growth pattern which is happening and the interest. So that is one big element of this entire thing, is where there's a leadership and policy which can actually create a positive impact and make things happen in the right direction as desired. The second is the mindset. You know, please see, and I think Simon alluded to that also, we are at a very critical transition point in our history. India is at that very interesting inflection point. And India's ability, which it has shown to adopt new technologies, to adopt new patterns, is something which is very critical in its ability to move forward as we move on to a new trajectory. I mean, we've had unprecedented growth. We are the fastest growing large economy on the planet. All these elements together bring that in. And then there is a very significant potential which is still waiting. I mean, look at our per capita consumption, and I'm looking at per capita, which is, I'm not even talking of total consumption, because there the numbers would completely be outstanding. But on per capita consumption, we are 1/13 of the US. Even China, we are 1/4 of the US. So look at that potential which is there. And that is what has enabled this entire system to take itself forward in such a fast manner. And the last point on that, if I may add, it has been the innovation prowess which is happening in the country. The MSMEs, the startups, and all those new ideas which are coming. Anita would be there next, and she would tell you she's been investing very actively in the Indian energy sector, and she's been looking at it. You see, the cost per unit of energy, which was there, let's say 5 years ago, has dropped dramatically. In the last tariff bids which we had, it's come down to 2.7 cents per unit. And technology and innovation also has a large part to pay with it. So I'm just trying to bring in the points that policy, leadership, the opportunity space which is there, and a very promising ability of a society of people to adopt new ideas and to take on a new trajectory. I think these are the elements which have resulted together in what we may say is a rather unprecedented story of growth and success. Back to you, Subbu.
It is really true that India's story is truly unprecedented. And like you interestingly mentioned, that India's renewable energy sector is 100% open to FDI. And we have seen private equities play a very critical part in this success of India's renewable transition so far. And I would like to get in Ms. George here. And like we all mentioned, that the private equity has been a crucial partner for India's renewable energy investment so far. So how do you see this role of private equities evolving from what they are today, so that we can meet our ambitious target of 450 gigawatt of renewables by the end of this decade?
Thank you very much, Subbu, and it's really an honor to be a part of this panel in particular, because I think if we look at the renewable energy sector, you have chosen, I would say, all the pillars on which this sector depends. So we have Deepak, who very eloquently just spoke about the policy aspects, which is absolutely critical, and we've seen that evolution. It has been dramatic and significant. We have Simon, and since I worked with Simon in the World Bank Group, I can say that it has played a very critical role in bringing in large renewable energy projects in India as well as in many other parts of the world. We have Pratik and Manav, who I think are really critical for the sector, because they are the people on the ground who actually execute, and their execution makes it possible for us to really move the transition from something on paper to reality on the ground. And a special mention to Manav, because I know, having been with the multilateral system, how difficult it is to do projects in our aspirational states, let's me put it that way. And hats off to you, Manav, for the work that you're doing. So really, I'm very honored to be part of this panel. You spoke about private equity's interests in renewable energy, and there is a prelude to that, Subbu, if I can really speak to that. I think initially, when the policy frameworks were being set, there was a lot of trial and error. And I believe in 2009, when I was with IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank, and we first financed the first commercial megawatt of solar in India. It was also the first commercial megawatt of solar for the entire World Bank group. So India's role as and evolution in the renewable energy sector is not just a story about India's energy transition. I would say it's also it plays a critical role in the world's energy transition. The way I see it, the whole world has to be behind us, because if we want to achieve the global targets, we need India to achieve its own very ambitious targets. So, why is private equity, and I'll talk about institutional investors, because in addition to the multilaterals, the big change that we are seeing are the institutional investors like pension funds and sovereign wealth funds that have come into the renewable energy space. And I think a lot of the credit for that really goes again to those early players who actually executed projects when there was still uncertainty on which way the policy would go. We shifted from a feed in tariff policy to a competitive bidding policy, I would say fairly early in the transition of the solar sector. And that was key because it helped to really have price discovery in the market. We have to give credit also to China because the availability of low cost solar panels worldwide really contributed towards helping the solar evolution to reaching grid parity. And that's where the competitive bid system became very critical, I think, in helping India actually to achieve pretty ambitious target of 175 gigawatts because we could get grid parity and come closer to what was needed. In terms of um, CDPQ, I can say that we've been very early players. Way back in 2009, we started investing in the renewable energy sector. And this was really a wonderful combination of being able to do good and make money for our pensioners. Because as we always say every day, whose money are we investing? We have to make sure that we can get the returns for our pensioners. At the same time, we have in our DNA a real commitment to climate change and addressing the impacts of climate change as not just a global responsibility, but as something where we really want to put our money where our mouth is. So back in 2017, we set targets of carbon intensity for our portfolio, and I'm very glad to say that our target was 25% reduction, and we are already at 38. In addition, we said we'll do more green investments, and renewable energy definitely falls in that category. And we have already invested more than $1 billion just in renewable energy in India, and another $5 billion in all other asset classes. And this is a commitment which we take very seriously. But the good news is that along with us, we have other institutional investors accounting for about 5 trillion US dollars of AUM who have also committed to measurement of climate impact, disclosure, and verification by third parties. So from an India perspective, I think I will go back to what Deepak said. Policy has been very, very important. As investors, we always look for consistency of policy, consistency and transparency. The second thing I would say, and why private equity has been playing a very important role, is that private equity and institutional investors like CDPQ have created platforms where we can aggregate these assets. And by aggregation, we've also been able to diversify our risks in terms of the off-taker risks. And Simon alluded to the improvements that we have to make in that aspect. So the combination of being able to diversify risk through aggregation on a platform, having consistency of regulation, and I would say the heart of the matter, which is sanctity of contracts that have always been signed. And I have to say this because I've been involved from that first megawatt of commercial private equity investment in solar. And obviously, the prices have come down over the years as the panel prices, as the balance of plant costs have come down. We have to be very clear that you cannot look back 10 years ago and say, oh, that was very expensive, so let's renege on the contracts. That would be the worst thing that India could do to be able to achieve its ambitious target of 450 gigawatts. And I really think both at the states level of the states and the center, honoring the sanctity of contracts should be something which we should be proud of. We have done that to a large extent, and that'll be key to enabling us reaching this ambitious goal.
Thank you very much, Ms. George. And it is true that institutions like World Bank, IFC, and CDPQ have played a very important and a key role in the success of India's journey so far, and I'm sure they will be here for the next decade of action. Now, shifting our focus from finance to infrastructure, I would like to get in Mr. Agarwal here. Mr. Agarwal, it's very often mentioned that there is no transition without transmission. So, how do you see the role of transmission in the India's decade of energy transition?
Thank you very much for having me. Well, it's true, there is no transition without transmission. Well, the good news is that India has already one of the strongest interconnected grids anywhere in the large economies in the world. We have one frequency across what used to be 5 unique grids. And I think this is a fantastic achievement, something that is the envy of many large economies in the rest of the world. Having said that, we have a unique problem. Well, it's not so unique. Most of the world has this problem, which is that the renewable resource is not where the fossil fuel resource generally lies. In India, most of the transmission got built in the last 15 years to evacuate coal-fired power from the regions of Orissa, Jharkhand. Today, 90% of new transmission needs to be built to evacuate solar from Gujarat, Rajasthan, or wind from Tamil Nadu, Karnataka. So you can imagine it's a new grid practically. At least the evacuation portion is a new grid. The load center grid connection is actually not doing that badly. I'll talk about intrastate later. I'm talking only about the national grid so far. Different studies have shown anywhere between $150 billion to $160 billion are needed to be invested in transmission alone to reach the 450 gigawatt target. It's not a small amount of money, it's great. Again, good news is that there has been very good debt and equity investments into transmission. We've been personally very proud to bring in all forms of innovative debt capital. And then of course, our flagship Infrastructure Investment Trust, which brought in several institutional capital, and it's now grown to about $3 billion in enterprise value just in the last 3 years, with an initial asset size of about 500 million. So the good news is that we have done a good job in creating the framework to attract investment into transmission. I'll very quickly move on and talk about the 3 biggest challenges that I see, which we need to solve as a ecosystem to really be able to ensure that there is enough grid infrastructure to evacuate the 450 gigawatts and take it to the last mile consumer. And I really like to simplify this and talk about it in 3 parts, which is space, time, and cost. The first problem is space, right? You can build large amount of solar infrastructure in places like Jaisalmer and Bagla, where let's say the space is not a constraint, potentially. But the transmission, you're always going to build in crowded places. India has one of the highest population densities in any of the large countries in the world. It also has one of the highest acreage under agriculture as a percentage of total land. It also has the 10th largest forest coverage in the world. All of this means that diverting land for transmission gets harder and harder as you try and build more and more transmission. And I think government has to think very, very creatively about how do you balance the needs of food land, agri land, forest land with the need for infrastructure, right? The second one is time. Pretty much since the birth of electricity, most planners are used to a 5 to 6 year planning cycle for the generation. Let's say a hydro or a coal or even a nuclear is even more, which meant that the transmission side of the ecosystem had an equal amount of time, 5 to 6 years to get the job done. That number has shrunk by 80% in the last 5 years, and generation is now coming up in 18 months to 24 months. Transmission sector hasn't kept pace because you're talking about very large challenges across the length of the country and not in a confined zone. Yes, you can build a solar park of perhaps any size in 12 to 18 months, if the land is in place, but transmission just hasn't kept up. I think something that the government has done really well is bring in competitive forces into transmission auction, something which India is really proud of, because apart from LATAM and India, I don't know of any large economies that have done this successfully, bring in competitive forces into transmission greenfield concessions. We are very proud as Sterlite Power to have built about 30% of all greenfield transmission concessions built in India so far, worth about $4 billion. And we're very proud to say that by using technology, the incentives were so strong for us that we used phenomenal technology like helicranes, drones, AI, ML, routing software to really crunch the time down and reduce it by as much as 14 months from the defined timelines, right? But it's still a challenge. We're still not at the same speed as building generation assets. And the last one I'll talk about is really the two C's, which is cost and capital. The reality is that transmission charges have gone up dramatically in the last 8 years by 3 times. The per megawatt per year transmission cost used to be 7 lakhs per megawatt per year. It is now 23 lakhs per megawatt per year. Large reason for this is that you're adding a lot of transmission capacity, but the utilization of the transmission, as you can imagine, is 30%, because the renewable it is connecting is, of course, utilized at about 20 to 30%. That's a serious challenge. And I think from a policy angle, and I might not be the most popular person in the room here when I say this, but the free interstate transmission connection was a very good policy for the first 8 years of this build out. It has to end, because people have to price and locate assets where their marginal cost of transmission is the lowest, and keep that in account when they're looking at total cost of that asset, right? It's no good talking about a 2 rupee tariff if it's in Bagla, but you're adding at least 1.5 rupees to that if you're bringing it all the way to Delhi. It's because the utilization of that line is so low. Whereas the good news is that we have so much spare transmission capacity all over the country. It may not have the best irradiation, but if you add the transmission costs and trade off with the irradiation, you're probably getting much smarter location of these assets than you've got so far for the first 30, 40 gigawatts that have been built. And finally, I talked about capital. I think that is the best part, which the government has done really well. I think transmission projects have been structured well, payment security is strong, and I have not found in the last 10 years a dearth of capital to get into this sector. So I'll pause there and maybe come back later.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pratik, for taking us through these 4 aspects. And it is indeed true that transmission is critical or mission critical for India's energy transition story. And of course, we cannot expect any transition without transmission. Now, coming back to Mr. Bansal, India has put a lot of impetus on the distributed renewable energy generation. So how do you see the role of this distributed generation in India's story of energy transition?
So thank you so much, Subbu. And I must say that it's a singular honor for me to be here. Normally, I would give my arm and leg to hear people such as these panelists speak, and to even imagine that there could be a day where I sit here and speak alongside Anita or Deepak, who have grown watching and seeing how they have taken leadership positions in leadership in infrastructure itself is a great honor. So I'm not sure whether I will be able to add anything besides what great words each of them have spoken. And just 2 minutes that they've spoken, they've actually hit the point so beautifully. Anita spoke about contracts and China. I mean, these are the issues that we have to solve. Deepak spoke about policy. And I think a key question which comes from there is, how do we as an industry respond to the policy? Because at all points in time, we will keep continuing to say policymakers do this, 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. I've heard this phrase all my life. But the question that is how, as an industry, we become an honest broker and speak about it. Perhaps that's something that we can talk about later. The question that you asked, Subbu, if I were to come to that, the data is actually irrefutable. The commercial and industrial clients consume about 51% of all the electricity that is consumed by India, and the installed capacity that they have is 1%. Pratik would know better than anybody else that microgrids and obsolescence of national grids is a secular trend. Whether we like it or not, that's where the world will be. Pratik also mentioned that we are probably solving last century's problems in those grids rather than this century's problems. So clearly there is the opportunity is so huge that it does not need to be told. I mean, there's a study, I think in May, actually the last month, which talks about it requires about $18 billion of investment in C&I space over the next few years. The key thing that I see when I look at it, and we were one of the earliest investors because our mandate is to actually take positions in industries which are evolving, bear the risk, put our shoulder behind, uh, trying to mitigate the risk. So big people like CDP can come and take it away and make much bigger, because we don't really don't have the money or the wherewithal to do what they can do. But what we can do at our end is to pave way. Be the front infantry so that the heavy cavalry can come and conquer. What we've seen in CNI is that it is about a mindset change. In the beginning, it were few industries who were taking positions and trying to see whether it works. Once it starts working, you would obviously see an exponential growth, because if it's worked for your neighboring industry, you become more uncompetitive. You will obviously do it just because the competitive pressure will force you to do it. Uh, Again, World Bank line probably was the key difference between a success and a failure of rooftop solar. And so we all know how grateful has the industry been, without necessarily realizing that some great men must have had that vision that India can actually transition to a microgrid and distributed solar, if only that $1 billion of line had been not created. So we must thank World Bank and organizations such as these to have created that line. Deepak spoke about innovation and ability of Indian entrepreneurs to do a lot. And distributed solar actually does that. So if you see distributed solar businesses, you do not see legacy businesses. You don't see rent-seeking families coming and taking it up. You see today's entrepreneurs, engineers, private equity professionals, normal people who were employees in different energy companies coming and taking it up. So to me, that is also a very fascinating aspect. And therefore, from my perspective, as I see it, the future is really bright on distributed solar business.
Thank you, Mr. Bansal. And indeed, it is important to acknowledge the support given by international bodies like World Bank for India's distributed renewable and especially the solar journey. Now, let us move on to the next phase of today's discussion, where we talk about the opportunities. Here, I would like to get in Mr. Bagla. Mr. Bagla, the previous speakers also mentioned how important finance is going to be to fuel India's renewable energy journey in the next decade. There are studies which say that we need at least $200 billion of investment in the next decade if we have to come closer to our target. So how do you see the opportunities for these investments? Because there will be an influx of hundreds of billions of dollars, because 200 billion is just for the generation. And Mr. Agarwal mentioned they require 180 plus billion only for transmission. So when there is a huge influx of these hundreds of billions of dollars, what are the opportunities for these investments in Indian ecosystem today?
Thanks, Subbu. Subbu, I'll draw your attention to the National Infrastructure Pipeline. That's the India investment grid, which is run by Invest India. Of that $1.7 trillion opportunity, which is lying there with actual projects which are looking for capital, over a quarter of that is related to renewable and energy. That shows you how big the opportunity sits. In fact, if you ask me, going forward at some point of time, India's energy story would be looked at in a similar manner as India's IT story globally. So in many ways that is, and just on the statistics on that one, it's, we'd probably require anywhere close to $500+ billion in the next decade, about 300 odd for wind and solar infrastructure, for another 150 odd for expansion and modernization, another 50 for grid firming, etc. And there's a lot of indigenization of the modules, the batteries, the SV, all that is happening together. The second thing, what has been the focus of the government on getting investments to be made more attractive? Let's look at it. Where does capital flow? It will flow where there's an opportunity. It'll flow where it is respected. That is where India is open to FDI at 100%. And it will flow where it gets into efficiency and returns. Now look at the two elements which is happening on that one. The first is, if you look, the focus of this government has always been on the ease of doing business. That is essentially reducing the risks of doing business, all those risk factors coming down and making capital more competitive in the Indian context. So be that decreasing the number of days to get approvals, or decreasing the number of days from where you get an approval to get an execution. I'll give you an example of Vestas, the world's largest wind power company. When they decided to create the wind blade manufacturing unit in India, from the day they got approvals to the day the first blade came out of their factory in India, was just about 14 months and a few days. And the best experience they'd had globally was 18 months. And in some other countries, the average was anywhere between 36 to 54 months. So what has happened in that is that we've shrunk the time distance for that capital utilization and obviously created it more competitive. And the other elements being that as I mentioned, the risk factors of getting the construction part of it, which is where the highest risk factors used to be, with policy and with all government support on the execution side and the ecosystem side, that coming down. So that is one element of it. And look at the other elements which are happening on a larger scale, the ecosystem development, the focus of the government to bring down logistics costs from double digits to a single digit to make it, again, India more competitive across the globe. So that is one side. The second is, and which has received very significant global acknowledgement, and why I say that is because my team is in the forefront of FDI coming into the country. And let me just mention on that one, that one of my top 5 sectors where I'm seeing this happening, renewables, is a part of that. In fact, my current order book, when I say an order book, that is where my team, I have a dedicated relationship manager for any investment coming in, where there are actual investments and plans. And before the start of this pandemic in March 2020, indicated investments, these are actual plans of projects in play, was anywhere close to 70 billion. Today, that is 168 billion. Even during this closure, I've had these number of projects coming in. And that is where I must tell you, renewables is on the top of it. One of the biggest things, and I go back to that point, is the new production-linked incentive scheme, which was announced by the government across 13 odd product categories and sectors. But renewables has a large part of that one. So first on renewables of over 600 million, and then on other aspects of it, for example, the batteries for storage, another 2 billion odd worth of incentives coming in. And by the way, all these incentive schemes were created by extensive and intensive discussions with all stakeholders. That is what makes India competitive. And this is where you will see a large part of investments coming in, both on all aspects of it. I mean, I take what Pratik said on the transmission side, on Manav on the generation side, but also on the indigenization of components which will go into this. And, let me take you back to my favorite point, which is innovation and startups in India. Subbu, this story will again be based on very significant disruption in the industry, which is going to be taken up by those startups going forward. And let me tell you, some of the new startups which will be hitting that unicorn soon are going to be out of the space in India. That is one of the most vibrant activities happening in this country. And I'm depending a lot upon them. And I'm seeing a lot of global interest in startups which are related to the energy sector, especially, which are getting not just local, but global funding. And put together, look at it, we're looking at another 50 odd solar parks coming. We've had some very interesting success stories. Look at the Kochi airport. I mean, it's a phenomenal story where you see how the people and the government got together to create, which is the world's first, actually, let me correct myself, not the first, the world's only 100% solar powered airport, and a significant one. So these stories are the ones which are now going to take over from all these successes which are coming in. And then we have Pratik, Anita, Simon, and Manav. You've been there for such a long time. I remember you were one of the first funds which got created on infrastructure. We've had our learnings from there. We've seen how flexibility was critical in bringing about some of these, projects which went on in their RFPs, etc. And I think all those learnings are now coming in together in a singularity to bring in the success, which is what we are hoping to on this sector. Thank you. Back to you, Subbu.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bagla. And I think the two I's, of course, the third I being India, is the innovation and indigenization, have been helping India's renewable success story so far. And like you rightly mentioned, will play an important role in the next decade also. Since we are on the topic of manufacturing, I would now like to ask Ms. George. Ms. George, India, as rightly mentioned by Mr. Bagla, and from the result that we can see from the newly announced PLI schemes, India intends to become a global hub for RE equipment manufacturing. In the wind, we are already one of the key players, but now with the intended schemes of PLI for both high efficiency solar cells and modules and battery storage, India wants to become the global hub in this equipment manufacturing also. So how do you see, or where do you see the key opportunities for this renewable energy equipment manufacturing in India? And are there any possible risks that need to be addressed from an investor's perspective?
Thank you very much, Subbu. I would say that in the manufacturing sector, just as in the renewable energy generation sector, key is, of course, policy. And we are very encouraged to see the recent policies with the PLI and other incentives for manufacturers to come to India, especially on the solar panels. I think one of the things that I would say is that I think India should not, aspire to a kind of manufacturing model that we've seen to be successful, let's say in China and other countries, because we should really go for where our comparative advantage lies. And the way I see it, the comparative advantage of India is really in software, where we can actually leapfrog the trend and become one of the most modern manufacturing centers of the world by really tapping into our ability on AI, machine learning, 3D printing. So what I would call it as the software heavy manufacturing. So use those, and we need to do it on a huge scale, just as what happened in the IT sector, which Deepak mentioned earlier, is really to create the talent pool and the skill sets that would be needed for this manufacturing. And I'd like to point out to two things which I think are critical. One, if you look at the renewable energy sector, 99% of the renewable energy sector is the private sector. So what the public sector has played a very important role, which is to catalyze, facilitate, but really the action has come from the private sector. So in manufacturing as well, I would say incentivizing the private sector to come into manufacturing on a long-term basis is going to be very key. And instead of just replicating what has been done elsewhere, I would say let's reinvent it, let's leapfrog, let's use all that entrepreneurial talent that we have. But this has to be done at a very big scale, and I'm looking directly at Deepak, because here I think the government and policy can play a big role of creating the incentives. So we have all our IT companies who themselves are transforming to the new reality of cloud-based and digital services. Let's really put a focus on AI and ML-linked manufacturing. That's one point I want to make. The second is creating an ecosystem. Whenever we see where India has really been successful, so if we look at the auto components sector, for example, it's the ecosystem that was created, I think, by Maruti and some of the early players in the auto OEM sector that actually created our leadership in the auto component sector as well. And in fact, I think that's the way we have to really think big, not just in terms of one manufacturing plant, but creating an ecosystem which also involves semiconductors, glass, polysilicon, whatever is needed in the manufacturing of the solar panels. A third very important thing, which I think we aren't focused on, and again, Deepak, I would say this is an area where the government also needs to come up and think about what our strategy will be, is the dependence on commodities. Because for both renewable energy and for manufacturing of solar panels, the dependence on rare earths, nickel, copper, cobalt, lithium for batteries. And if you see the global trend, 40% of the demand for these minerals are really coming from the renewable energy and the energies, and I would say the EV sector from automobiles. And we need to figure out how does India really get its supply of these commodities in a way which is cost effective, as well as the availability is there on a long-term basis. The third point I would say is, again, we should think ahead of what do we need to do in terms of storage as well as in terms of recycling, because these are all very important commodities and materials. All of those solar panels which were set up from 2008 onwards to today are going to have reached or completed their useful lives in another couple of years. How are we going to recycle these panels? How are we going to make sure that we can handle the waste that's going to be generated both from there as well as from EV batteries? So I think I would say broadly that on the manufacturing side, incentivizing the private sector, creating the ecosystem, creating the skilled talent pool, and making sure that the raw materials like commodities, which are scarce, that we have a line of vision in terms of availability and cost.
Thank you very much, Ms. George. And I'm sure, and I'm very much confident that we have a government which is very responsive when it comes to incentivizing the sector, which has a potential to change our country. And it is pretty evident from the PLI, where higher preference has been given when it comes to solar, from polysilicon to module. And of course, on the recycling also, we are aware ministry is working with organizations like us to come up with a cohesive policy on recycling and addressing it. Now, let us shift the discussion to an interesting point by talking about the elephant in the room. And here I would like to request Mr. Simon to jump in. Mr. Simon, we know the elephant in the room is a power distribution sector, and I want to know from you, what role do you see the India's distribution sector play in energy transition, and what are the kind of challenges that we know will be coming up, and we should be ready to face them right on?
Thanks, Subbu. Correctly put the elephant in the room. I think all of the panelists in some respect have either directly touched on the issues that are arising through the lack of commercial performance, for want of a better term, within India's distribution and retail sector. And I think it's one of the principal issues that is going to have to be dealt with for a scale up and continued acceleration of India's energy transitions. Let me just step back a little bit and talk about how we view the context for energy transitions across the energy sector and place the distribution sector within that. We tend to see that there are three principal pillars to supporting India in its energy transitions. One is in the power sector, comprised of core energy transitions, building up an alternative to fossil fuel generation, building the renewables, building the transmission systems, investing in battery storage, evolving wholesale power markets. Alongside that, demand and supply side energy efficiency. Let me come back to the power system. The second pillar is really around industrial energy use and the decarbonisation of that, particularly coal use for high heat process in steel and cement production. This is a harder sector to deal with, but it's the second highest emitting sector in India after the power sector and can't be left off the table. And then the third pillar is complementary to those first two. As you invest deeply in energy transitions within the power, industrial and transport sectors, you create stress within the legacy industries that have fueled India to date. And I talk principally about the coal mining sector and the coal thermal power sector, already rife with non-performing assets and already creating stress within the financial sector. And I think the third pillar is really about a just transition for those legacy industries so that we don't create significant headwinds through some of the social and financial issues that will arise if acceleration of retirement within those industries is too aggressive. Let me come back to the distribution sector because it plays a role within the first two of those pillars, most significantly the first pillar, which is the power sector. This is the cash engine for energy transitions. And when it is ill-performing, when it cannot return on the investments it has made, and particularly in the instances where it remains in public sector ownership constructs, it rests on the cusp of bankruptcy. This has implications for investments in all of the other elements of energy transitions. I think the current outstanding overdue arrears to generation companies from the distribution sector at the moment is somewhere around 1.3 lakh crores, around $17 billion. That's an outstanding sum. And it speaks to unsustainability, that the sector can't continue to pay poorly for the generation that we're trying to transform. It represents significant risk, probably the most significant risk to investment within energy transitions in India, and it needs to be dealt with. We can come back to how that needs to be dealt with later, and I think that goes to some of the challenges. I think arm's length governance, depoliticization of electricity supply. I think it's okay to be aiming at universal public access and the provision of electricity as a public good, but it's not okay for electricity supply to be a source of political capital. So arm's length governance within the public constructs, but also greater private sector participation within India's distribution sector as part of the solutions to address this challenge. So that's the first point. We have to fix the cash flow. The value chain has to work from end to end to de-risk and allow private capital flows into energy transitions around investments in renewables and storage, etc. The second issue, and I mentioned under the power sector, that we look at that in three components. One is core energy transitions, the investment in the alternatives. The other is demand side of energy efficiency, looking at the way energy is used and making sure that's efficient. The third is supply side energy efficiency. And this again is where the distribution utilities, the discoms, the retail sector is key. At the moment, aggregate losses run at around 20%, about double the global average. You can't afford to lose 20% of what you generate at source before it gets to the consumer. So working on a reduction on those losses is also critical to India meeting its nationally determined contributions and in addressing climate change. And I think the solutions to that are partly in the governance construct of the distribution utilities, again, putting them at arm's length from political interference, or bringing in private sector participation. And we've seen great success in terms of private sector participation in the distribution sector in India. It also rests in better business process, better human resource management, and better deployment of technology, particularly smart technology within the distribution sector. Just to underline this, Anita pointed to the fact that India's energy transition is a global issue. And it's easy to get the international community keen to invest in what we see as core energy transitions, in the renewables, in battery storage. Manav spoke about the support that we provided to the solar rooftop sector in India. It's easy to get concessional financing to spur investments in those areas. What is not clearly understood is that the distribution sector is at the heart of the success of these investments and de-risking the broader market. And I think we need to continually bring this into focus. If we want to transition India to cleaner, more sustainable sources of energy, then we have to deal with those fundamentals within the distribution sector. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stolp. I think you made some very interesting arguments there, which I am sure will be critical for India to take into consideration if we want to succeed in our energy transition story. Now, shifting the focus to the distributed renewable sources, I would like to bring in Mr. Bansal here. Mr. Bansal, it is true that out of the installed capacity of India today, a major chunk comes from the large scale utility or centralized installations. But there is an argument that supports the growth along with the spread of renewable sources in our country. And there are some set of energy pundits who always talk about small is beautiful. So now, in your opinion, are there any innovative financing models that can sort of accelerate India's distributed energy proliferation so that they can play a role in this decade of energy transition?
It's a fascinating question, Subbu, but what I want to do is nuance the distributed energy provision away from solar for a moment. And I also want to bring in one sector which is kind of overlooked in lots of our discussions, and that is biomass. There is an estimate which suggests that if India were to use all its biomass, India's annual import bill for oil will go down by 40%. Now, just to put that in perspective, if we take about $125 billion as India's import bill, that goes down by about 50 billion. Again, to put that in perspective, to make it easy to understand, that is almost 5 times or 4 times what we spend on highways annually. That is more than 3 times what it will take to vaccinate the entire country against corona. And that is what we can save just by using the biomass that we either let go waste or burn. The challenge there is, and in any of these distributed energy businesses, is the construct that these are just energy generation units. That may not be sufficient. If you are closer to the consumer of electricity or energy, you have to consider yourself as a provider of energy, and your ability then to innovate and bring in lots of solutions around that. Just like a marketer, you are then looking at energy as a service, and therefore it moves away from a cost of capital gain, and it becomes a premium offering of energy. And over a period of time, the player has to move away from just an energy provider to an energy solution provider, and there it brings whether the concept of storage, whether it brings in solution of oil and efficiency and the like. And the key again there lies in what Deepak keeps mentioning: innovation and indigenization. To the question that you asked about innovative solution, while I do not have a solution at a much larger level, but some of the examples that I can give from working in the biomass sector is that for biomass, you can actually provide this financing to the farmers instead of to the enterprises, backed against the ability of the enterprise to actually pay the farmers. So you're solving multiple issues by that innovative financing. You are giving money to the farmers, they increase their income by about 7% annually. Even if the crop fails, they still have that biomass. You're able to distribute the risks in a much more significant manner rather than have a concentrated risk at the enterprise level. And I'm sure there are hundreds of such examples that we can innovate and do. And once again, once they are germinated all over the country, somebody big has to then take it up and make it, do it at scale, because that's what India can do really well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bansal, and it is very important. And the point that you made, it is also interesting to see how it coincidentally overlaps two of government's key schemes, doubling the farmers' income by 2022, and of course 175 gigawatt of renewable energy target. And I'm sure these kind of innovative models are required for us in order to realize our energy targets and achieve true transition. Now shifting the focus back to transmission. Uh, Mr. Agarwal, renewables without any doubt are going to be a major part of India's energy basket. They are already starting to be now. And of course, by the end of this decade, if everything goes right, there will be almost 45 to 50% of energy generation coming from renewable sources. In order to accommodate this high amount of intermittent renewable sources, as well as to facilitate the so-called distribution or transmission from RE rich states to RE poor states, do you think there needs to be some evolution in the transmission infrastructure by in the way we perceive it? You already made some interesting comments in the beginning, but I want to sort of ask your perspective on the best practices that other countries already adopt when it comes to high voltage DC or ultra high voltage DC lines, optimizing the T&D losses per se.
Sure. When we talk about resilience in the transmission infrastructure, there are really two aspects to it. One is, can the grid absorb intermittent power, and what will it take to achieve that? Second is really nothing to do with renewables at all. It's to do with resilience of the grid, regardless of the source of power. Maybe I'll focus a little bit on the second one for now, and I'll come back to the first one in the next question. This morning I Googled about California, and California has been having a tough time with its wildfires. And for the first time, they're announcing that they will most likely have blackouts in California this year. There's no other way they can manage to control the wildfires. They have to shut down parts of the grid so that they avoid contact with the dry leaves. So I would say that the impact of climate change is very, very material, very, very serious on the resilience of the grid. Again, I always like to bring in some good news. So, the recent cyclones of Tokte and Yas, Western East Coast, actually, told us that our grids are doing pretty well. We didn't have any serious blackout either in the regional or the state or the national grid as a result of that. I think most of the restoration work has already happened. But having said that, future-proofing our grids are really, really essential. Most of the planning guidelines, probably all the planning guidelines, have a backward-looking the system. What are the wind speeds of the last 100 years? What are the weather patterns of the last 10 years? Unfortunately, none of that is useful anymore. And the erratic weather and climate is completely unprecedented. I think one very important thing India needs to do is to have a proactive regulatory framework which allows asset owners to continuously strengthen their infrastructure proactively, which is then paid by the regulatory asset base, and do this by regular revision of grid standards, right? So if wind speeds are going up in a particular area, we can't wait for 5 or 10 years to recognize that. We have to do it on an annual basis. I think this is something that we can do, and we can learn from perhaps some of the mistakes of the Western world. Again, going back to California, they are now going to spend $6 billion in the next few years only to reduce upgrades or only to execute upgrades linked to wildfires, right? I'll also bring in a little bit of technology over here. Use of artificial intelligence, image analytics, and IoT can play a very, very serious role in increasing grid resilience by giving advanced information before the grids were to have a blackout. We have one such investment in a Finland-based drone and image analytics company, which is one of the largest suppliers of image analytics to PG&E, which is in the Californian grid. And I'm very, very enthused by the amount of the stride that we're making in that space to actually bring in AI, ML, and IoT to improve grid resilience. I'll talk more about technology and HVDC perhaps later on, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Agarwal. And I think it gives us so much confidence, or it fills us with confidence to see the resilience of our infrastructure, especially when we are subjected to cyclones or some natural phenomena, and we are able to bounce back within no time, which was not possible even in developed economies like US or the countries.
So should I cover that part now? Are you short of time, or are you?
Yeah, we're short of time, but if you can quickly do it, I'm able to.
Let me do that in a minute or two. So coming to technology, yes, high voltage direct current is a great technology. It's been around for a while. It reduces losses over long distances. But I'd really like to talk about two other technologies, which is really grid connected battery storage, right? Again, I go back to some of my examples in the US where California, for example, has installed, I think, 4.1 gigawatts of grid-connected battery storage. This is very important. This is not batteries connected to the solar or the wind plant, nor are they connected to the load center, which is the consumer. This is connected directly into the grid. So the grid operator can absorb power in the peak time and can release power in the off-peak time, and can also deal with intermittency in a much smarter way. India, during the lockdown, saw as much as on certain days, as much as 30% of its share of energy on a given day coming from RE. 30% is something I never imagined 5 years ago to happen, right? Germany has seen several days of 49%. Some economies have seen 100% on certain days. I would say a very aggressive policy on grid-connected battery storage is the need of the hour. And the best part is the regulation already exists. You can simply merge it into the existing transmission regulation and have an availability-based charge, just like they're doing in Arizona, California, or parts of Australia. The second thing I'd like to say around intermittency is really, the more you have large grids interconnected to each other, the more you can take advantage of capacities, inertia, and loads in different countries, right? This is again something we have seen play out very well in Europe. There are, most countries in Europe are connected to each other in some way or the other, and this allows countries like Germany to have a high amount of RE on a given day, despite the intermittency of that RE, and not yet having, by the way, any significant battery storage. This is something we require in India. I'm very proud of the One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative, which I know World Bank is also leading. And I believe that this is must happen for us. If we want to bring in 450 gigawatts of RE by 2030, we must have large grids like Saudi Arabia, GCC, and the East, which is the entire Southeast Asian grid connected to India, so that the grid operators can take advantage of multiple sources of consumption and generation.
Thank you, Mr. Agarwal. That's really helpful, and I'm very optimistic more than ever about the resilience of our infrastructure in the coming days. So before we conclude, I know we are running out of time, but quickly, I would like to give 1 minute each to our panelists, and if they can, in less than a sentence or even in a word, can sort of express what are they looking forward in this decade of India's energy transition. It can be one word or one sentence, but that will sort of act as a trailer, and also it can help the viewers grasp the key words that are pertaining to the energy transition story. Let's start with Mr. Simon.
Thanks, Subbu. That's a tough ask. Let me attempt in one sentence. It's been a fascinating experience being involved in India's energy sector development over the past half a decade. What really excites me looking forward is what I see on the horizon for India's energy sector. I see the emergence of a much more sophisticated system. Going back to what Pratik has just said, bringing in battery storage technology at grid level, shifting to e-mobility, looking forward to a future where green hydrogen plays a part in the energy mix. I also see a government that is increasingly interested in addressing some of the legacy issues that will arise as pressure builds through this energy transition. And one of the areas that I'm really excited about is the fact that we've just recently engaged with the government in a discussion on how it can support legacy industries through the potential downturn that they will face as renewable energies and other complementary technologies arise. And that's exciting because that addresses one of the significant headwinds to energy transitions within India and will have global impact. You know, I keep on coming back to what Anita said, that this is not just an India issue, this is a global issue. Thanks, I think that was more than one sentence.
I'll take the sophisticated infrastructure from your answer. Mr. Bagla, your turn.
Subbu, very clearly, we are at one of the most interesting inflection points in our history, not just in ours, but in this sector, energy. I see India, the story has just begun where we are concerned. And I see a huge role for India as you see it on the global spectrum. And this is going to be driven by very large level of disruption. Both Pratik and Manav have seen it, and which is again going to be created by a lot of, propelled by a lot of creative destruction and innovation, and which is also going to be propelled by a large number of MSMEs, which are now going to get involved in this level of innovation. So the story has just begun.
I think that's a very, as good as any sentence we can get. The story has just begun. Miss Anita George.
Thank you, Subbu. I would say that innovation and stewardship, and I think India can play a big role. One of the things we are doing institutionally is to aggregate institutional investors. So we have a huge pool of capital, like the Investor Leadership Network is $5 trillion. I think India can do the same in terms of initiatives like the One Sun, One World, One Grid. Technology, and here just hearing what has been said, in addition to the innovation, there's also the flip side, which is cybersecurity. And I think that's an area that India can not just focus on and improve, but become a leader in. The third is talent, where I think, again, India can play a huge leadership role, especially in new areas like deep tech. And the fourth, I would say, is a clear climate strategy for India, where we take into account a comprehensive way in which we look at carbon. And this can take many shapes and forms, but it's clear that we need to provide a push that can really take us to becoming net zero as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much. I think talent and innovation are the key takeaways here, and there is no argument there. Mr. Agarwal?
I'll try and stick to the one sentence, which is, fix the distribution sector of India with aggressive privatization, and everything else will fix itself.
On point. Mr. Bansal?
Like the famous president, instead of a moonshot, we can have an energy shot and say to ourselves that before the decade is out, India shall be the largest renewable market in the world. It shall be the place of growth, innovation, and solutions for the entire world.
Thank you, Mr. Bansal. And thank you all for today's session. It was very interesting to hear from all of you. And India is often lauded as the land of opportunities and land of possibilities. And if everything goes right, we will definitely dictate the energy transition of the world being in India. And as our Prime Minister rightly mentions, India is definitely showing the world that sound environmental policies can also be sound economic policies and can be sound economics. And I don't think we can end this session with a better sentence than to just say the story of India's energy transition has just begun and it is here to stay. Thank you again to Mr. Bagla, Mr. Simon, Ms. Anita George, Mr. Pratik Agarwal, Mr. Manav Bansal for your valuable time. And I'm sure our viewers are very, very, very interested in taking away some of the key aspects that you mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for giving your inputs on financing India's decade of energy transition. Now we'll proceed to another session. Stay tuned.